bro shit. It's time for some gay bro shit. Get into it, gay bro shit. Let's fuck with it, gay bro shit. Hey, hi, hello, bros and thems. This is Gay Bro Shit, a podcast about body image, fitness culture, and gender in contemporary queer life. I am Dan. As a reminder, I have been a trainer for 10 years. I'm also a rugby coach and rugby player. I have an MBA, a BFA. I've started multiple businesses, and most of the time, I feel like a complete fucking failure. So today is the first real episode I'm recording, and it's kind of a big one. So this episode is called the Fitness Primer, and it's meant to be practical advice for those getting started in their fitness, quote unquote, journeys. So it's intended to be a general playbook for how to accomplish some common objectives. And it's also something that I can refer back to in future episodes to say, here's how you can do X, Y, or Z. But we need to know that my understanding is going to evolve. And I'm also being very intentional with the amount of information I'm giving. So this episode could have easily been 6+ hours. And I just don't think it would be practical for anyone to act on that amount of information. I find that people do a lot better getting sort of a smaller amount of information that they can then put into use and then continuously refine. This is also not meant to be prescriptive, meaning these are not things that are going to work for absolutely everybody. They're just things that work for many people. And anyone who tells you that something works for everyone is either trying to sell you something or doesn't know what the fuck they're talking about, or probably both. So don't ever buy into a one-size-fits-all solution or program, because it's just based on a foundation of lies. So we live in the age of the influencer, where people who look good are sort of automatically assumed to be an expert, when the reality is they probably look good, mostly due to genetic factors, and also quality camera work, good lighting, and very commonly, some amount of drug use. In psychology, we call this, I act like I'm a fucking psychologist. I'm not. So in psychology, they call this the halo effect, which is when we assume somebody has expertise or quality just based on the aesthetic factors. My point being, don't just accept the advice of someone because they look good on the internet. And that's easy for me to say because I'm totally faceless and you can't see any pictures of me. And yeah, who knows? Maybe I'll put some up at some point, but that's just not where we are right now, because I don't think it's that important. And I don't think that my credibility should be based on the way that I look. Is that because I'm naturally a fatter person? Sometimes when people look at me, they assume that I couldn't possibly know what I'm talking about, even though I've had many certifications and a ton of real life experience working with a lot of different clients. You know, I remember when I went to business school, one of my classmates was like, well, how can you be a trainer? You're fat. And I mean, it was kind of offensive, but also kind of funny. And, you know, the reality is that people actually do respond better to trainers who look closer to them versus people who look, let's say, extremely rarefied. Most people have better relationships working with a trainer of that nature. All right, so talking about fitness, the big thing that we have to accept going in is that fitness is inherently a process, and it's a lifelong process. And it's not a process that ever really has like a clear endpoint. So you may have a set of goals and then you reach them, and then maybe you'll be satisfied, but most likely you're actually not going to be satisfied once you reach your goals. This is just kind of the existential cycle of things. And what you do is you do your best to sort of pick a new goal, but it can feel sort of Sisyphean, you're always just sort of pushing a rock uphill. But the more that you lean into enjoying the actual work of it, the process, then the more you're going to get out of it, and the more likely you'll be able to stick with it. So another thing I definitely have to say up front is that fitness is really a luxury. And the best fitness for you is going to be the fitness that you can afford and that you have the time for. And fitness as a concept really is only about a century old, because before that, it wasn't something that we had the resources or the time to pursue. We walked everywhere. We had physically demanding jobs. We were constantly pregnant if we have uteruses. And so pursuing fitness requires free time. It also requires disposable income. It requires having an able body, and having free time and disposable income are very modern features. Many people still don't have these things. And so the pursuit of fitness is heavily linked to class. Eating clean, quote unquote, is very expensive. Working out with a trainer is expensive. Supplements are expensive. At the extreme end, getting plastic surgery is extremely expensive. So there's a reason why rich people and celebrities can look a certain way. And that is by design. That is a feature of capitalism. I have a friend who likes to say, you're not fat, you're not ugly, you're just poor. And I think that is very much the truth of the situation. And we don't need to look far to find people who can model that for us. So don't go spending beyond your means in the pursuit of fitness. Don't go into debt. So before you do begin pursuing fitness, if you have the means, the way that we're going to approach this is by identifying a goal. You can also have more than one goal, and we'll get to that. The way that I sort of group goals when it comes to fitness is two categories. So the first one is going to be functional goals. So the most common one of these is to just be healthier. You'll also see people just looking to get stronger, maybe gain more stamina or endurance, also recovering from injury or getting better performance for athletic purposes. Those are all functional goals. And then we have a separate category, which realistically are the things that people want but can't always achieve. And those are the aesthetic goals. So in that, we're going to talk about losing body fat. We're also going to talk about gaining muscle mass, muscle size. And just to put a trigger warning up front, there's going to be talk about dieting, calorie counting, and just measurements in that regard. And that could be potentially triggering for somebody who has a history of eating disorders or, let's say, body dysmorphia disorder. So I'm going to give a warning before we move into that section so you can choose to stop listening at that point. So these goals don't have to be exclusive. You can pursue one at a time, but you can also pursue multiple goals at a time. A lot of them actually come together. You can get healthier, get stronger, get bigger, and lose body fat all at once, but it's going to be a slower process than if you say focused on one or two of those areas. Especially losing body fat is hard to accomplish while also building muscle size. Those are the two that don't generally work very well together. And we'll get into that when we talk about that. All right, so let's start off with the functional goals. So the first one I mentioned is just to be healthier. This is when I was working with clients, this was the number one thing. I think almost every single person mentioned this as their number one goal. And fortunately, it's also the easiest goal Because the reality is that doing something is better than doing nothing. Doing something more than you're already doing is an improvement. So yoga is great. CrossFit's great. Something like Orange Theory or Barry's Boot Camp, going for a run, playing sports, literally just going for a walk. These are all things that are great for you. If you break it down, doing something once a week is 100% better than no times a week. It's not just 100, it's infinitely better, right? And then let's say you're able to do something twice a week. That's 50% better than doing something once a week. So that's a very big increase right there. If you can do something 3 times a week, that's 33% better than twice a week. And after that, you start to get diminishing marginal returns in the sense that each additional workout brings a little bit less additional benefit. And really, the best workout for you is the one that you can afford, the one that you can do physically, and the one that you enjoy. That is what you're going to stick with. Doing anything will lead to a positive increase in mental health, sense of well-being, better sleep, better stress management, improved cardiovascular function. Now, if you have more specific health goals, such as sort of controlling blood pressure, I said that weirdly, or sort of controlling your blood sugar, then the specifics, the modality might need to change. And if you have a really specific health goal like that, that's definitely something where you're going to want to work with a healthcare provider to make sure that what you're doing works for your health needs. Next most common goal that I would hear from clients is the goal of just getting stronger. And just like getting fitter, what's nice about this one is that any sort of strength training you do, even a very small amount, is going to get you stronger. So you can do as little as 1 set for every main movement pattern in a week and gain strength, especially if you're not doing anything now. There's a set of basic movement patterns. They are knee drive, which is essentially taking your legs from a bent position to a straightened position. So that's going to be lunges, squats, any sort of leg press. The opposite of that is a hip hinge. And that's kind of where you take your hips from being bent to straight. So for that, you're going to see things like a deadlift is kind of the big iconic movement for that. But there's some other ones that are sort of similar that will accomplish that. Then for the upper body, we have horizontal pushing, which is mostly chest pressing. So that's going to be like a bench press, a chest fly, your arms going from a bent to a straight position forward in front of you. You also have a vertical push, which is pushing overhead. So taking your arms from a bent to straight position, like a shoulder press, any sort of deltoid movement will get that for you. You have a horizontal pull and a vertical pull. So a horizontal pull would be like a row, and a vertical pull would be like a lat pull down or a pull up. And then finally, we have 2 sort of core related patterns, but they're actually like ideally not movement based. So you have core stability, which is kind of your body's ability to resist like spinal flexion, which is like bending your spine. And then you have rotary stability, which is your body's ability to like resist turning force. And in functional fitness, which is sort of the school that I come from, usually you want to train for stability rather than movement. So when we talk about getting stronger, and we'll also need to sort of understand this concept later when we talk about getting bigger as well, and that is the principle of progressive overload. So what that means is basically as you continue to work out, you're going to need to make things a little bit harder, right? So you can add weight, you can add reps, you can do more sets, you can do more exercises per muscle group. You can change your stabilization. So say going from something that involves like say using both arms at once to one arm at a time. All of these are ways of sort of making the workout more challenging And these all contribute to that idea of progressive overload. So basically, your body adapts to the changes that you throw at it. And once you kind of are fully adapted, then you need to find a way to push past that. So it is really helpful if your goal is strength training to keep a notebook or like an app on your phone and write down the weights that you use, the reps that you use, and see how that changes. Because it's going to create a positive feedback loop for you. And that recording is going to make it easier to just sort of jump right into your workout and be like, okay, I need to start with this weight because that's what I used last time. And then maybe you can add a little bit to it if that goes well. That's generally sort of the way that you would add weight, which is the most common way to induce progressive overload, is by starting with the way that you used last time, doing all of the sets that you would plan to do. And if you get to the end of them and you feel like you could definitely do a few more, then you're probably going to want to add a few pounds. It could be something as small as like 2.5 pounds or 5 pounds or even 10 pounds if you're really feeling it. And after you take a rest, then you're going to do that same number of sets again with that new weight and see how that goes. And then you can continue to add weight until you get to a place where it's kind of difficult for you, right? You want it to be at least fairly difficult. Because you want to keep track of your progress, I also recommend that you don't change your workout up too much. So it's okay to switch out movements, add things in, or sort of skip things. But in order to see that progress and track it, you really need to be repeating the same sort of lifts or exercises frequently enough so that you can really track that. If you have access to a gym, and fortunately gym memberships are fairly inexpensive these days, you know, you could get something like a Planet Fitness membership for $20 a month. You can just start out by using the machines that they have in a big commercial gym. And honestly, they're a great way to get started because they guide your movements and it's hard to do them wrong. And it's also easy to add weight progressively because there's like a weight stack and you just have to slide the pin down. And if you only ever use machines, that's totally fine. I would say from a functional perspective, free weights are a little bit better because they incorporate more muscles into the movement. There's always a prime mover with each sort of exercise or movement, but then there's also sort of secondary muscles that are recruited into it to help stabilize that joint. And so by using free weights, because the weights are able to move in a 3-dimensional pattern, you use more of those stabilizer muscles. So it's a good idea to progress towards free weights, but it's also a bit harder because you can get injured with them a lot easier. If you can't go to a gym and can afford it, you can buy a fairly inexpensive suspension trainer, which is TRX is the most common brand name, but the generic versions are significantly cheaper. And it's basically something you can like sort of strap over a door frame and use it to do resistance work using body weight, but at different angles to make the exercises harder or easier as needed. And that's also a great thing to take with you if you're somebody who travels a lot. You could also just get some basic dumbbells. Like those will work. The only issue with dumbbells specifically is that are a little bit harder to make things harder in terms of progressive overload because you're kind of just stuck with the dumbbells you have. Whereas if you go to a gym, there's probably going to be like a pretty big set of dumbbells and a variety of weights. It's a lot easier to go up or down than if you just only have one set of dumbbells. There are like some you can buy that kind of adjust, and those can be good. But again, it's ultimately a little bit limiting. But as I said before, literally doing anything is going to make you stronger. So whatever you can get your hands on, I think it's going to be a good choice for you. Now, if you want to get super strong, then eventually you're probably going to want to progress to barbell training. And at that point, it's going to be probably a good idea to hire a coach or at least work with like a more experienced lifter to teach you the technique. A basic personal training certification usually doesn't cover barbell technique, so you're probably going to want to look for somebody who has a specialized barbell certification. And there's a variety of those. It would be great if you could work with that coach for a long period of time, but maybe just like 1 or 2 sessions just to get the general techniques down would be a good investment. So another functional goal would be to build endurance. So sort of like the principles we applied to strength training, with building endurance, you kind of want to apply the same principle of progressive overload by adding time or distance slowly to your exercise. So, for example, if you want to get into running, it's okay to start by just aiming to run, let's say, for 5 minutes. And you run for 5 minutes, and at the end of it, you feel like shit. And that's totally okay. But then maybe a few days later, you're going to go out and run 5 minutes again, and maybe we'll feel a little bit less like shit. And then eventually you do that enough times, and 5 minutes going to feel like no problem whatsoever. So then you're going to add a few more minutes, right? And you're going to repeat that process basically until you get to the point you want to be at. And that doesn't necessarily mean that your goal should be to run a marathon and slap that little 26.2 sticker on the back of your car, because the reality is some people are just not built for endurance. And that's a genetic factor and not a personal failing or a lack of effort on your part. So if you feel like running long distances, that's totally great. And if you don't, that's also totally great. But you don't need to be able to run for a long distance in order to be fit. That is just one metric that people will look at. So some additional functional goals that are just worth mentioning here. A big one is sort of rehabbing from injuries. There's way too many specifics here to cover on a podcast because it's just really going to depend on the nature of the injury, the severity of it. And in this case, it's definitely a really good idea to work with a physical therapist or a trainer who has like injury rehab experience to specifically work with your body and your injury. Another common functional goal is to increase sports performance. And sort of like with the rehab, there's too many different sports to cover. And so I recommend, again, working with a coach if you can. But also, like, there's a lot of publicly available information on the internet just in terms of how to improve performance at your particular sport. And there are definitely trainers out there who have sports performance certifications. Those are specialist certifications. So that is something you could look for. But you're probably just going to be able to get a good amount of information on the internet to help you with that. An example, in rugby, you have to train for a lot of different things because you have to be able to sprint. You also have to be able to make quick directional changes. You have to be able to tackle someone. You also have to be tackled. You have to push people. You have to drive people. You have to jump. And sometimes you have to lift people. So you have to be strong. You have to be big. You have to be dynamic. You have to be fast. You also have to be just generally fit. And so that's a lot of different types of things to train for. And so that's why, like, I'm not going to sort of sit here and recommend specific training protocols for you because it really depends on the sport that you're looking to play. Now, in a perfect world, everyone would do some exercise that builds strength, some exercise that builds endurance, some exercise that gets your heart rate up, and some stuff that improves your mobility and reduces injuries. But again, the reality is whatever you can fit in, whatever you have the time and resources for, is going to be what's best for you. All right, so now we're going to move on and talk about the aesthetic goals. So this would be a great time to stop listening if you have any history of eating disorders or disordered eating. I think it is possible that people who have had eating disorders could possibly pursue aesthetic goals safely. But I would say it's best to just leave the bullets out of the gun, so to speak, and not necessarily take that risk if that's something you can avoid. So just go ahead and dip out and hopefully come back for the next episode. And we'll see you then. So the first aesthetic goal we're going to talk about is probably the biggest one, the thing that the most people are looking to achieve, and that is to lose body fat. So before we get into that, it is very important for us to stop and ask ourselves, why are we looking to reduce our body fat? Because a doctor or medical provider has said that you need to lose weight for health reasons. And that's an entirely different topic of conversation because doctors don't always know what's healthiest for people in terms of body fat. And there's a blanket recommendation to sort of lose fat for your health that is untethered from the actual health consequences of being bigger. There's a great podcast out there called Maintenance Phase, and they do pretty deep dives into topics related to this sort of fat phobia, both in the medical world, but also just sort of the larger world. And I definitely recommend listening to that. And it's great to get perspective from people who are fat and have always been and sort of experienced the consequences of fat phobia in our society. So we mentioned the medical reason, but most likely the reason that you're looking to lose body fat is because you think it's going to make you look more attractive, be more likely to attract a potential partner. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it, right? Those are valid reasons to do something, but you have to at least be honest with yourself about that and say, okay, this is why I'm doing it, or this is why I think I need to do it, and recognize that you may reach your goals and still not feel like you look good and still not feel like you can attract a partner, because the problem was never that you were fat. The problem was always how you viewed yourself and how you put yourself out there in the world and interacted with other people. So losing fat cannot solve those deeper issues. That's something that's going to take a different type of work. And again, it's okay to lose fat just because you want to, right? I'm in the middle of like a cutting phase now because I just feel like I look better with less fat, but I'm being really honest with myself and saying the reason I feel like I would look better with less fat is because I'm constantly fed images of people who have less body fat than I do. And that in my head is what I think is desirable, right? So that's what's informing that. And I know that, but I'm still choosing to do it anyway because I actually like the way that it makes me feel when I'm working towards a goal, we'll just say, but also sort of eating very intentionally and working out very intentionally. So now, if you are a fat person who has always been fat, the truth is you're probably not going to be able to lose more than, let's say, 10 to 20% of your body weight. And you're going to be a lot happier if you can move toward accepting that fact rather than trying to constantly change your body in different ways. So, in all of the things that we've studied, right? All of the things that we've tried to make fat people less fat, that is the most we've ever been able to sort of universally achieve is up to like a 20% body weight reduction. So the thing that comes the closest is bariatric surgery, right? So like lap band, surgery of that nature. And that is a pretty extreme surgery that has a lot of life-changing complications. And so it's not a great place to use as an anchor, right? It is really hard to learn to accept your body as it is. It's probably always going to be somewhat of a struggle, but we have to recognize that being fat is not necessarily unhealthy in and of itself. And you can't tell by looking at someone if they're healthy or not. So it's always a good idea to eat intuitively, eat what makes you feel good, eat what you can afford, and eat what your body can tolerate. Then we're really into the luxury territory, which is what I said at the beginning, where we said fitness is a luxury. So once we've kind of started to unpack that, or at the very least look critically at it, then we can actually talk about how it is possible for most people to go about losing some body fat. So the first thing we have to say is you want to run in the opposite direction of anything that promises a rapid reduction in a short amount of time. There's just literally no good way to do that other than liposuction, right? Which liposuction's fine. Get it if you can afford it. Don't care. But anyone sort of selling you on that is probably selling you on some sort of crazy crash diet or something that's going to negatively impact your health. And almost certainly you're going to rebound from that and gain all the weight back you lost and then some. Sustainable way to lose body fat is to create a mild energy deficit. Functionally, that works as eating a little bit less energy in the form of food as you output in the form of exercise and activity. So you probably heard the phrase calories in, calories out to explain the energy system of the body. And that's actually a wild oversimplification. And it's definitely the case that the more you look into it, the more information you get, the more confusing it actually becomes because there's a lot of variables. And I'm going to just simplify as much as possible because there's a good reason why most people have a really hard time losing body fat. And that's just because of how confusing it all is. So there's a lot of problems with the calories in, calories out model. But in terms of just practical application, the biggest problem with most people is that they have both no idea what they're actually consuming and no idea what they're actually expending. And there's a pretty big learning curve that you have to overcome in order to be able to do this successfully. And that's probably why this doesn't work for most people, right? And our bodies are also very good at adapting to the energy we supply, and we'll find efficiencies. So eventually, this mild caloric deficit will stop working, right? Because your body's going to adapt to it. So there is a strategy that can help with that, and we'll get to that later. In an ideal system, which our bodies are not an ideal system, but that's okay. We'll just pretend like they are. What we would look to do is reduce our caloric intake by about 500 to 1,000 a day. And if you do that, you can lose a pound of body fat a week at 500 calories a day, or up to 2 pounds with 1,000 calories a day. And that doesn't sound like a lot of weight loss because it's not, right? But it is sustainable. And it's something that you can actually accomplish and stick with. But it doesn't sound like a great promise. And that's why there's not a ton of people out there marketing this, because it's just not a very marketable idea. So you're going to think about the amount of fat that you want to lose and basically turn that into the amount of weeks that you're going to need to go for to successfully accomplish your goal. And I would always suggest starting with the smaller goals. So just thinking in terms of 1 pound a week. So if you've got to lose 20 pounds, then you're going to need to go for 20 weeks in order to be able to lose that. And 20 weeks is 5 months, like pretty much half a year almost. And so that's going to be a long process. It's going to feel like a slog, right? And you kind of have to accept that going in if you want to make it work. Now, you could speed this up by having a bigger deficit. We mentioned going to 1,000 calories a week. But what's going to happen to you is you're going to feel much more energy depleted and your willpower is really going to suffer. You're probably not going to be able to do it for very long. So again, if you've ever had an eating disorder, I don't think that you should be looking to track your calories in any meaningful way. Just don't even think about it. So we need to kind of accept in this process that what we are doing is approximate. Like we can't ever figure out our exact energy expenditure. We can't ever figure out our exact consumption, but we can try our best to get close. And so we have to settle for that closeness and work towards that. First problem we have to solve is we need to figure out our energy expenditure. So the most accurate way of doing this in a reasonable setting, meaning not in a laboratory, is to get a wearable device that measures your heart rate. And these are not 100% accurate, but they can probably get you within a few hundred calories, which is the amount of accuracy we really need. And just as a digression, the only really accurate way to measure caloric expenditure is to basically like put somebody in a sealed chamber and measure their respiratory gases. So basically like what they're breathing out. And so it's not really easy and practical to do that for most people. And so that's why, we kind of have to rely on the information we can get from things like that and extrapolate it to other activities outside of that environment. But of course, once you take somebody out of that environment, the outcomes are going to change. So back to the fitness tracker. So these things are not always cheap, right? I got a Fitbit recently for about $100. There's definitely some that are less expensive and certainly some that are more. If that's not something you can afford, there are sort of free calculators online that will get you a decent approximation. So when I plug my numbers into one of these online calculators, and I got a result of 3,100 calories per day consumed. Now, if I'm comparing this to the Fitbit that I've been wearing, that one says that my average was 3,900 for the same period. Now, I have a physical job, and so it may just be like that's what the disconnect is. In my case, the calculator is maybe not super accurate, but I think for most people, if you have pretty reliable lifestyle in terms of how much activity you're doing, I think it's an okay way of going about it. So I mentioned I bought this Fitbit recently, and before that, I had actually been using this app on my phone. I have a Pixel, so it's Google Fit, and it measures your steps, and you can also use it to track your workouts. And it gives you step counts for the day. It also gives you caloric consumption. And I was kind of operating under the assumption that it was pretty accurate, but one of the reasons why I got the Fitbit was I really wanted to compare them and see what happened. So, I mentioned my average sort of calories extended last week on the Fitbit was 3,900, whereas on the phone, on my phone, it's closer to about 3,200. In terms of the step count, the difference was the phone was logging about half as many steps. So it would say I'd taken 8,000 steps, whereas the Fitbit would say I'd taken 16,000. And so that's a pretty big difference. So I tended to do like a more controlled experiment where I compared the two, but after a few days, I pretty much just gave up because it just wasn't really worth it. Now, I've also sort of seen a few studies where they had participants wear a Fitbit and some other wearables as well on a treadmill, and then had cameras trained on the treadmill to measure the actual numbers of steps taken. And in that experiment, the fitness trackers they tested, the Fitbit actually undercounted the steps, and then some of the other trackers they used overcounted the steps a little bit, but in most cases they were close by within 100 or two. And also the study that I saw I want to say it was 2018. So it's been 5 years. So there's a good chance that they've updated their software in the interim years and probably gotten more accurate. I also saw that some studies around the same time period, 2018, 2019, where they compared the caloric expenditure numbers to other methods. And actually, I'm sorry, I didn't really look at the study to see what the methods were. It could possibly be that the methods that they were comparing it to were not great. So take this with a grain of salt. But in those studies, they found that the fitness trackers tended to or the Fitbit specifically, was overestimating the amount of calories consumed. So this is when it gets confusing, because it's like, on the one hand, the study's saying it's undercounting your steps, and on the other hand, it's saying that like it's overestimating our calories, and then we're comparing it to other things which are saying less. So it's very confusing when we get down to the weeds of this. So again, this is why we can only really get approximate and do our best, right? So I think getting a fitness tracker is probably a good investment. It doesn't have to be a Fitbit. There's other brands certainly out there. Try it for a few weeks at least, just to figure out what you're actually already sort of expending in terms of energy. And, maybe wear it for a long term if that's something you're able to get good use out of. Now, there's a subscription fee associated with this. So, it is an ongoing expense. It's not super expensive as far as I'm concerned, but if you have a different income level than me, then it might be a bit much for you. I do have a minor gripe though, and that is the Fitbit likes to vibrate and give me notifications that I swear I've turned off multiple times, and I really don't know how to turn them off, because I swear I've gone to the settings and turned them all off, but it's still sending me notifications that I just don't need. Like, I was sitting on the couch during my one rest day of the week, and it starts vibrating, and it's like, it's time to move. And I just yelled at it to fuck off, because I was actively resting on purpose, and it needed to mind its own fucking business. So I have to say, there's been like at least 2 or 3 times a day where it's vibrated on me, and I've just yelled fuck off in the middle of, I don't know, wherever I was, the gym, the grocery store, work. Obviously people looked at me weird, and I had to explain why I yelled that. Might get annoyed with that if I can't fix it, we'll just say. Okay, well, if it's just a matter of using more energy than you take in with food, well, wouldn't it be possible to do a bunch of extra exercise and get a fat loss state from that? That is true, right? In theory. But what we actually find when we really look into it is that what generally happens when people do a lot of extra exercise is that their food intake just goes up instinctively. And the other thing is that their what's called non-exercise activity, so like fidgeting, shaking your legs, stuff like that, that all goes down to compensate. And so oftentimes you end up just sort of with the same energy expenditure anyway. The other thing is that it takes a lot of time to get that many calories sort of expended. So for me, if I'm trying to put myself in like, say, a 500 calorie a day deficit, it would take me like an hour of exercise to get that deficit versus just eating 500 calories less, which takes me a lot less time. So I don't necessarily want to go get on the treadmill for an hour. That's just not something I want to do, and I don't really have the time for it. It just doesn't work for most people. And the reality is most people don't have, say, 6-7 hours a week to exercise, which is what it would take to get that same sort of caloric reduction. Now, it'd be great to do both food reduction and an energy increase through exercise at the same time, but, may not be practical for everybody. So with technology, measuring our actual caloric expenditure is getting a lot easier. But of course, we also have to measure the food that we're taking in. And turns out this is actually a bit harder. So most people have no idea how much they're eating. They generally don't understand what the sort of macronutrient composition of food is. I remember when I was working with clients and would sit down and talk to them about nutrition, and I would advocate for them eating more protein, and people would say things like, well, they eat a lot of nuts. And I had to be like, well, nuts aren't just protein. They also have carbs and fat. And so that's just to illustrate the point that like most people don't really know the macronutrients in their food. And by macronutrients, I of course mean carbs, fat, and protein. And in order for us to be healthy and happy, we need to have all three. The ratio you use them at is going to depend, and we'll get to that in a second. But going back to just sort of measuring how much food we're actually eating, whenever people have done a study on this, where they ask people to report the amount of food that they're eating and then look at what they're actually eating. What they find is they're underestimating by at least 10%. And there's one study where I found that people were underestimating by 47%. So you're probably going to be wrong about your food intake unless you're carefully measuring everything out with a food scale. And I don't really recommend that for most people because it's one of the signs of disordered eating. And I think that that's potentially a very slippery slope for a lot of people. So we're going to want to advocate for being, I would say, a little bit looser about it and just try and approximate to the best of our ability. The easiest way to figure out what you're actually eating is to use a food tracking app and to be very thorough with it and even report things like alcohol consumption to it. So the two tracking apps that I have the most experience with are probably the most popular. So MyFitnessPal is definitely the most popular one. More recently, I've been using a different app called MacroFactor. MacroFactor is a subscription-based service, so you do have to pay for it, whereas MyFitnessPal is free. But MacroFactor also has some features that MyFitnessPal does not, and I'm sort of finding that I like it a lot better than when I tried using MyFitnessPal in the past. So to start off with, you're going to want to get one of these apps on your phones and just try and track down everything you eat and drink without it making any changes to what you are consuming. Side note, though, or related note, really, is that when this has been studied, they found that just the act of tracking your food generally changes what people eat because they start to make value judgments, either consciously or unconsciously, about that food and how the app is telling you if it fits into what the app thinks you should be eating. So know that there's a very real possibility that your food habits will change just a result of logging your food. The apps, I would say, do a really good job with branded food or packaged food. They usually have a built-in barcode scanner where you can just scan the package and it will instantly pull up the nutritional information, including sort of the standard serving size. What they don't do so well with is home-cooked food, which I find kind of perverse because in general, cooking your own meals is healthier. Obviously, not everybody can do that for a variety of reasons, but the consensus is that that's better for you, right? But the apps kind of reward packaged food because it's just so much easier to track. They also don't do very well with, let's say, food from other cultures. So like the other night I got takeout and I got pad see ew, which is, if you don't know, like a Thai noodle dish, and it's probably like the second or third most common Thai food dish that's ordered on a regular basis. And it wasn't really in there. So I just kind of had to like find something similar and log it and just hope for the best. But if you're someone who has, I don't know, who eats a lot of takeout or eats a lot of food that's maybe not typical of the American diet, then you might have a harder time using an app to track your food. And really the hardest thing about using the app in general is just figuring out the measurements, because it's very hard to just look at food and visually assess if it's a tablespoon or a teaspoon or an ounce or a cup or a gram. And so where the learning curve is, and also why you have to accept some degree of imprecision. And the more you maybe occasionally get out the measuring cup and actually measure things, the more you'll start to get a sense of how much is in something just by looking at it. So it does get easier with repetition. All right, so now we think we have a good system for tracking our expenditure, and we think we have a good system for tracking what we take. Then we can start to manipulate the calories that you're taking in and the macronutrient mix. So as I explained, there are 3 macronutrients. There is carbs, fat, and protein, and your body absolutely needs all of them. Your brain heavily relies on carbs. your joints, all of your connective tissue, also your like endocrine system, your hormones are very reliant on fat. And of course, protein is sort of the essential building block for muscle and tissues of that nature. So you need all of them. And it's tempting to just say, I'm going to cut out the fat because fat has a lot of calories. But what you're actually really doing yourself a disservice there. So the recommended ratio for the standard Western diet is that you want 50% of your calories to come from carbs, 30% to come from fat, and 20% to come from protein. But when you are looking to reduce body fat, it's often pretty effective to just reduce the carbs from 50% down to something like 40 to 45%, and then increase your protein to something like 25 to 30% of your calories and keep fat about the same. It's probably best to eat minimally processed foods and eat a lot of plants, eat a lot of like fresh fish and farm raised meat and free range, whatever. I think it's best if you don't focus too much on food quality because it's a really slippery slope. And there's actually an eating disorder called orthorexia, which is where people get too focused on eating quote unquote clean to the detriment of their mental health. And at some point, we'll be covering that in another episode, not today. But, you know, we can say that's ideally what we would do. But going back to what I said before, we're going to eat what we can afford, eat what makes us feel good, eat what's available to us, eat what we can enjoy as much as possible, right? Now, while it's probably better to get your protein from meat, fish, eggs, you can also get it from like cheeses, yogurt, soy products if you're vegan, like tofu, tempeh, that sort of thing. It's also totally fine to get a lot of your protein from protein powder. It's affordable, fairly shelf stable, and for me, most importantly, it's very quick to consume. It's not something that I have to spend a lot of time chewing. And when I'm consuming a large amount of food, I truthfully do get tired of chewing. So I think that it's totally okay. We also can say it's probably better for you to have fruits and vegetables be your main source of carbs along with whole grains, but not everyone has access to those. Some people live in food deserts. Some people can afford them. So white rice is fine if that's what you have available to you. Sugar can even be fine. Not for everybody, obviously, and not in huge amounts, but sugar is at its root a carbohydrate and a pretty simple one that it's easy to measure. I would say one of the most important things we can do is avoid giving value judgments to food. We don't want to say food is good or bad. We don't want to say it's healthy or unhealthy. We don't want to say it's clean or unclean. Food is just food, right? It serves a function. It does not have an inherent value. And any way that you can get food is acceptable. Yes, some ways might be better for you, but the best food for you is the food that you can actually access. So if it's a choice between eating nothing and eating fast food, you are better off eating fast food every time. And anyone who kind of tells you otherwise has a really warped perception of the world. Tangent aside, it may take you a few weeks to get this all figured out just in terms of what you're actually eating and what you're actually expending. And then we're going to sort of execute the fat loss phase by creating a mild caloric deficit most days of the week. Because I find that sometimes you're going to want to be able to eat a pizza or maybe go out drinking with your friends. And I think that that's totally okay. As long as you're not doing it every day, as long as you're not doing it most days, I think it is a good thing to allow yourself to deviate and then go back onto your plan the next day or as soon as you can make it happen. Because having that all or nothing attitude of like, well, I ate pizza today, so therefore everything's fucked and I'm just going to give up. That is really how you set yourself up for failure. Negative self-talk. And I just don't think that that's productive. So giving yourself kindness and forgiveness is a really important part of the process. So I mentioned before, you can probably only lose about 1 to 2 pounds a week. And so it's probably going to take a while before you see results that you can visibly see. The scale might shift a little bit, but it's not going to shift overnight. The way that you look in the mirror is not going to shift overnight. And again, you just have to buy into the process. Now, if you've gone, let's say, a month of eating in what you think is a caloric deficit and you're not seeing any results, then it's a good time to stop and reassess because something is probably off with your energy equation. Either you're taking in too much food or your energy expenditure is actually lower than you think. Take a pause, manipulate one of those variables, right? Most likely just reducing your calories a little bit more and try again. You might have to do that a few times. And also take into consideration that your weight can fluctuate a lot. So 5 pounds during the course of a day. For example, one morning I weighed myself before and after peeing, and it was almost a 2-pound difference. It's a good idea to weigh yourself first thing in the morning after going to the bathroom, measure yourself most days and take a rolling average of those weights. And that's probably what your true weight is. Don't go by the lowest number. Don't go by the highest number. Go by something closer to a median. And I will caveat that with weighing yourself every day is also a sign of disordered eating or eating disorders. So we need to be really mindful of that if that's something we're going to be doing. Final piece of strategy here is that if you have to lose, let's say, more than 10 pounds, it's a good idea to do your fat loss phases in pulses. So say you're going to diet for 4 to 6 weeks and then take 1 or 2 weeks off to eat closer to what would be considered maintenance for your body. Let your mind relax, let your body relax, and then go back into that weight loss phase for another 4 to 6 weeks and repeat that until you get down to where you want to be. And at the end of that, once you reach your goal, then it's probably a good idea to just hang out in what would be considered your maintenance phase for, let's say, at least as long as you spent cutting or dieting. And from there, you can go further if you really want to. Or you can just be in maintenance forever, or, decide that you don't give a shit anymore, which is also totally healthy and normal. If you're a much bigger person, getting down to something like 20% body fat might be a good goal for you, right? If you're maybe a little bit leaner, getting down to around 15% might be a good goal. But after you try and get down to about 10% body fat, once we get there, it becomes significantly harder for a lot of people. So I don't really recommend setting your sights on that or below. We'll talk in another episode about sort of figuring out how to figure out what your body fat percentage, but also just sort of figure out like what your genetics want to dictate. But again, if you are like sitting at like 40% body fat, somebody who is very much considered obese by the medical establishment, and you need to lose like 50 pounds or something to get even close to that 20% body fat, this is just probably not something that's going to work for you. And that's okay. And there's nothing wrong with your body for being the way that it is. And the best course of action for you is to move towards accepting your body the way that it already is. And you don't have to love your body, but you at least have to accept it. Practicing what is called body neutrality, which is just sort of saying like, okay, my body is a body, right? My body is functional. My body does what I need it to do. Sometimes I don't like my body. Sometimes I don't like its functional limitations, but I'm just accepting it because I don't actually have a choice in the matter. And ideally, we would all feel this way all the time, and we have no pressure to change or conform to any sort of standards. And I would love to live in a world where there's no fucking body standards that are imposed on other people. But we know that that's not the reality. And as we turn towards society that is more open and inclusive, we can still acknowledge like what we're dealing with in the present. On the subject of fat loss, there is something that is very trendy right now, and it's 2023. Who knows if this will still be trending in a few years? But everybody's talking about the weight loss drug Ozempic or Wegovy. This is a drug. It's called semaglutide, and basically it's an injectable. It works by reducing your hunger. People are talking about it because in studies, some people have been able to lose up to 20% of their body weight. And so it seems like it's really promising. And a lot of people are saying, oh, this is maybe the thing that's finally going to eliminate fatness. But we've been through this cycle before with any number of other things, and they always don't end up working out. So we need to be real cautious going into this one as well, and thinking that it's not going to be the answer to the quote unquote obesity problem, because there is no fucking obesity problem. The problem with obesity is that people are fat phobic. But one of the things about Ozempic / Wegovy that does seem to happen is that people lose a good amount of body fat, but they also tend to lose a lot of lean mass as well. And so lean mass, our muscle tissue, is not something we really want to get rid of, because that having more lean mass increases our metabolism. It also is what makes us stronger, makes us less likely to get injured. And that creates kind of a negative cycle where you lose lean mass, so then your metabolism lowers, so then you have to diet further, reduce your calories further, then you lose more lean mass. I think that that's just sort of a downward spiral that people just probably don't want to get into. The reality is also of this drug is that it has a very valid medical use for people who are diabetic, and there's a pretty serious shortage of it right now. So we need to reserve that drug for the people who actually fucking need it, and not for people who just want to take it as a shortcut to look skinny. As I mentioned, the lean mass loss is a pretty big deal. This is kind of another general point about fat loss, is that usually when people lose weight, they're losing an amount of body fat, but they're also losing some amount of muscle tissue as well. I've heard it said, or I read somewhere, that it was like generally it's about 70% of the weight, 75% of the weight comes from fat, and 25% comes from lean mass. And for the reasons I just explained before, that's not really a great thing. But you can use strength training, and if you're eating enough protein, you can really minimize that. Another drug that everyone's talking about is testosterone as TRT, or testosterone replacement therapy. This also really helps with that, because it can actually help you to gain a bit of muscle during a fat loss phase. And we will definitely be talking about testosterone in another episode, probably in like 3 episodes. It's a really interesting topic, but I've seen like blood work from people who were on testosterone, comparing that to people who were natural bodybuilders while they were in a fat loss phase, and the sort of hormone levels of the people who were dieting and not on testosterone were, we'll just say, well below the normal healthy range. So there's a very negative impact on hormones that happens with fat loss. And that's why, as it turns out, a lot of bodybuilders or people who are on, we'll say, performance-enhancing drugs, steroids, they're just as likely to use the drugs during a cutting phase as they would a bulking phase, because they're looking to preserve as much muscle tissue as possible. Steroids will also be something we'll be covering in the future, so stay tuned for that. Another aesthetic goal that somebody might have is to get more toned. And if your goal is to get more toned, Congrats, because you've already achieved toning, because there's literally no such fucking thing. Just doesn't exist, right? What people actually mean when they say they want their muscles to be toned is that they want their muscles to be visible without necessarily getting big. So how do you do this? Well, you strength train so your muscles are a little bit bigger and more defined, and then you lose fat so there's less other tissue covering your muscles hiding it. That's it. That's how you get more toned. So I'm noticing that my voice keeps getting higher and gayer, which, fuck it, I'm okay with that. But it's funny that that's what comes out when I get tired of talking. But we're almost to the end here. So now it's time to talk about another aesthetic goal, another real big one. And maybe the reason you're here, actually, and that is getting bigger. So fuck yeah, it's bro shit time. Finally, right? What the fuck is the name of this podcast if this stupid faggot is just going to talk about modest fitness goals and achieving things in a sustainable way? That's not why you're here. You want to be fucking swole as hell. You want to look like, I don't know, like King Kong and the Hulk had sex and had a litter of weird ass babies. That's what you want to look like, right? So, all right, we want to get bigger. So again, we're sort of going to need to stop and really assess the origin of our desires to look a certain way. Where is that coming from? What's informing that and why? And whether or not that's something that's realistic or attainable for you or would even improve anything about your life, because the answer is it probably won't improve much about your life. Although I'm going to say something totally contradictory now and say that as I've gotten older and also bigger and more muscular, my success in a lot of realms has definitely increased. So you know what? Fuck it. There is definitely some benefit to getting bigger and looking stronger and looking more muscular, that it's kind of impossible to deny. Let's be honest. And again, we kind of wish we lived in a world where that wasn't true and people could kind of just look like whatever the fuck they want to look like, and that would be totally okay. But that is not the reality of the situation, right? So we have to be pragmatic to some extent. All right. So we want to get big, right? As with what I said before about strength training, the goal with getting bigger is going to be progressive overload. We want to add sets. We want to add weight. My dog just made some noise in the background. I don't know what her deal is. It's fine. And we want to create constant little challenges to our body in order to be able to grow and progress. Now, you can do size and strength at the same time. You can get both stronger and bigger, but at some point they're going to start to diverge. And so you probably don't really need to pick a specialization until you've been working out for a long time, or you kind of establish that you have a specific goal in one or the other. And doing any sort of strength training is going to add muscle size if you don't have much. So just like I said before, doing something is better than nothing. And you're going to get some results, all right? But there is a sort of more idealized way of training if our goal is to get as big and muscular as possible. So we need to train in a specific rep range, which would be anywhere in the 6 to 20 rep range is the range that works best for getting the most size development. Just taking a step back, our muscles have multiple adaptations, right? There is an adaptation for power, which is basically maximum output over very little reps. So that might be like a 1 rep max situation. We have strength, which is a bit more sustained. Typically, you're going to train for strength in say the 3 to 6 rep range. And then we have hypertrophy, which is muscle size. So your muscles get physically bigger. And that's what we're actually looking to achieve here. Beyond the hypertrophy range, which is about 20 reps, then we get into the muscle endurance range. And Your muscles might still get a little bit bigger there, but that's more about sort of the conditioning aspect of it and less about the aesthetics. So we need to train in that specific rep range, 6 to 20, as I said, but I would say 8 to 12 is really a good general range just for the sake of simplicity. That's the range that I usually train in for whatever the fuck that's worth. Although sometimes I do more. And we also ideally need to do a certain number of sets for each muscle group per week. So if we're just starting out, 3 sets per muscle group is a good minimum. If we're looking to get really big, though, we probably want something closer to 10 sets per week per muscle group. And for advanced gym goers, advanced lifters, you can get up to 20 sets in a week. But what happens is you start to get diminishing marginal returns, and that is that the first set is by far your most productive, and each set is a little bit less productive until it becomes useless. So this is where the concept of junk volume comes in, and that's basically beyond a certain amount of reps or sets, the energy is basically a waste because you're not going to get any growth out of it, and it could also be harmful and really impair your recovery. So don't make unnecessary journeys. Don't take chances on treacherous roads. Don't make the mistake of thinking that more is always better. It's definitely not. Now we want to talk about how we want to arrange our workouts within a given week. And this is called a workout split. There is a classic split. Sometimes it's referred to as a gym bro split. And that is that on separate days, you focus on legs one day, back one day, chest one day, and shoulders one day. And maybe you do abs on one of those days, and you probably do arms with your shoulders or with your chest or whatever, right? That's the classic setup. There's also what's called a functional split, which is when you do all of your push moves on one day, which would be, as I mentioned closer to the start of this episode, a long ass time ago, all of your push moves are going to be your vertical and horizontal push, so like your chest press, your overhead press, your triceps are also a push muscle. And then the pull moves, which are like your row, your pull down, your biceps are also a pulling muscle. And then doing legs on the third day. What I actually do is that I take functionality to its sort of maximum conclusion, which is that all muscles are either push or pull. I do a pull day that includes lower body moves. So on my pull days, I'm going to do a row, a lat pull down, but then also any sort of hamstrings, any hip movements. So that's going to be like your deadlift. I do remaining deadlifts, any sort of like hamstring curl. That all belongs on the pull day in my split. And then on the push day, you're incorporating any knee drive movements. So squats, lunges. I also do glute bridges or glute strengthening, glute stuff, butt stuff. I do butt stuff on the push day as well. That works for me. And I actually do push and pull twice each per week. So I'm generally working out 4 times a week. That way I'm literally never skipping leg day because I'm doing leg day 4 days a week. And sometimes I throw in a 5th day and I'm doing legs 5 times a week. So if you want to look like you never skip leg day, the answer is to not do legs on a separate day at all and just do them every goddamn time you work out. In general, it makes more sense to try and hit muscle groups more than 1 day a week, because as long as you have decent nutrition, which we talked about before, particularly in terms of protein intake, and you're getting good quality rest, then you can train your muscles more often and you'll see, let's say, probably faster muscle size gains by taxing your muscles more often. So like with our bigger muscles, those can probably recover within, let's say, 2 days. And then your smaller muscles can recover in 24 hours. So you could potentially do arms every day of the week and continue to grow. I try and do every muscle group at least twice a week for that reason. It also helps because you can spread out your sets. So rather than doing, say, 10 sets of chest exercises on the same day, you can do, say, 5 on one day and 3 days later, or whatever works for you. And I think that helps to spread out things a little bit. But of course, there are people who are doing the traditional split and getting a lot of sort of benefit out of it. It's still what a lot of professional bodybuilders do. And I also think that sort of for most people, working out 5 days a week is the most that they can probably realistically sustain. There are obviously people who work out 6 or 7 days a week, but they're usually professional athletes and they have really good nutrition, really good recovery. When we talk about recovery, sleep is definitely the most important aspect because the longer you sleep, the more of your sort of repair and regeneration occurs. So we sleep in 1.5 hour cycles, and basically, the more cycles you get, each successive cycle has more recovery potential. One of the big things is that our body makes human growth hormone, and that growth hormone is generally released after about 6 hours of sleeping or 4 sleep cycles. So that's why you'll hear athletes who sleep like 10 plus hours a day because they're just getting a lot of growth hormone naturally. And I will say there are people out there who don't need a ton of sleep. You probably already know if you're one of those. But, most people need somewhere in that range of like 6 to 9 hours. Sleeping more is probably going to make you feel better. In terms of the individual workouts itself, it's usually better to organize them so that you start with the bigger muscles closer to the center of your body and then work your way out. So these are going to be things like your big compound movements. So your squats, your deadlifts, your bench press, your row, and then you're going to move out away. So let's say we did chest press, then we're going to move to our shoulders and then finally our arms and then forearms. If we're doing legs, we're going to start with our quads, then maybe work down to our hamstrings and calves. I'm not going to recommend a specific program for you because there's any number of programs that you can find online that are free. And, maybe some of them are a little bit suboptimal, but most of them are going to get the job done and be totally fine. And I would say just kind of, do what works for you, but keep the principles in mind that I outlined here and alter the workouts as you need to, switch out the movements if you need to, change the way that they're arranged. Also, you can definitely engage in a little bit of trial and error, or test and adjust rather, as I would like to call it, where you try something and make tweaks to it, keep making tweaks, and if you don't like it, find a new program. A trainer for a long time, I've always written my own programs, and I suppose that's quite a luxury because that's real easy for me. But I do sometimes look at other programs just for either inspiration or new ideas or just sort of confirmation that what I'm already doing is a good idea. All right, so another big consideration is how hard you train when we're focused specifically on muscle size. You don't want to use a weight that's too light and you don't want to use a weight that's too heavy. So ideally, you should get to the end of your rep range, and what you kind of want to feel when you hit that 10th rep, that 12th rep, whatever, is that maybe you could do 1 or 2 more, but that's probably it. And if you realize you can do more than 2, then that weight's not right for you and you need to add to it. So we don't have to train to complete failure to get growth. That's kind of a bit of a myth, right? There's definitely people out there who advocate for totally training to failure, basically doing all the reps you can until you can't do anymore. But you probably don't need to. I would say leave 1 or 2 reps in reserve. That's literally what that principle is called. And you'll suffer a little bit less, and it might make your workouts a little bit more pleasant. Another thing that we can do other than adding weight is to really slow down the tempo of our movements and increase the time spent under tension. So each movement we do has an eccentric phase and it has a concentric phase. So the concentric phase is sort of the main movement that you're doing, and then the eccentric phase is the releasing of it. So let's say for a bench press, when you're raising your bar off your chest, that is the concentric phase. And if you're lowering it, that's the eccentric phase. So eccentric is building the tension and the concentric is releasing it through effort. And what you really want to do is emphasize the eccentric phase for maximum growth. So the tempo that's kind of ideal is that you should take 1 second for your concentric phase. So, like 1 second to push the bar off your chest, and then 2 or 3 seconds to release it. And it might feel like you're going way too slow, but if you do this and you do it consistently, you really will start to see a pretty substantial difference in the quality of your workouts. Honestly, it's kind of really fucking satisfying. I don't know why, but it is. I also think it's really important that you emphasize a full range of motion with each move. So, full range of motion depends on the exercise, but basically, when you're exercising a particular joint or movement pattern, so like let's say you're doing a bicep curl, your arm needs to go from all the way straight to all the way bent. That's a full range of motion. If you're doing squats, you need to go from fully standing to basically low enough that your hips are at least a little bit below your knees. If you're doing a bench press, you want to get the bar down so that's nearly touching your chest and that your elbows are, 4 or 5 inches at least behind your shoulders. So if you can't successfully do full range of motion and you can't successfully control the tempo, then that means that you need to drop the weight that you're using, even if it means taking a hit to your ego. It's very critical that we don't compare the weights that we are lifting to the people around you, either for the negative or the better. It's also important we don't compare their bodies, right? Focus on your own movements, focus on your own process, focus on your own growth. Okay. It's okay to be inspired by the people you see around you or to see someone moving a lot of weight and just aim for that number, but don't use what other people are doing as an anchor for judging your own progress. All right. So if we're looking to gain muscle size, we should also probably increase our food intake by a modest amount, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 to 300 calories extra per day. The reason for this is that your body obviously needs food to fuel your muscle protein synthesis to grow bigger muscles. But if you do too much extra calories, then what's going to happen is you're going to end up adding fat at a equal or even more significant portion than muscle. And then that's something that you're probably going to have to take off later. So avoid that. There's kind of two schools of thought when it comes to eating for quote unquote bulking. There's the one side that says it's okay to do what's called a dirty bulk, where you just kind of consume as much food as possible, eat as much calories as possible. You don't really care about the source of it. You don't really care about the quality of it. And then the other school of thought is called quote unquote clean bulking. And I fucking hate the word clean when applied to food, but in this instance, it means focusing more on decent quality food and not super overdoing it with the amount of calories you consumed. And the goal with that, of course, is to put on less fat that you, again, might need to take off. And, eating in a caloric deficit is a lot less fun than eating in a caloric surplus. So you probably don't want to set yourself up to a situation where you have to work really hard to lose that fat again and maybe lose some muscle along with it. It is possible to lose fat and gain muscle at the same time, especially if you're eating a lot of protein and especially if you're optimizing your hormones, TRT or something else. But it is possible. It's just harder and it's going to take a lot more time. One last thing about achieving aesthetic goals in general, and that is when you want to change the way that your body looks, it is really important that you moderate your alcohol consumption. Alcohol has a lot of negative repercussions just in terms of what it does to like your sleep, your recovery, your ability to work out hard the next day. And also, I don't want to give a value judgment to food, but like in terms of like alcohol does have calories, but our body doesn't really know how to use those calories for anything because it's not something it considers food. So it's essentially empty calories. I would say if you have a really hard time controlling your drinking, that I would focus on that before you think anything else about sort of your fitness journey, right? Because just sort of getting a handle on that is really going to improve your life considerably. And there is a ton of stuff to talk about when we talk about alcohol, and particularly in relation to queer social culture. And so there's definitely going to be a lot of future conversations that are going to happen about that. And it can be really hard to balance moderate or controlled drinking with an active social life and participation in culture. Fortunately, there are more people who are not drinking anymore. So, there's a lot of people out there who are doing successfully. If you find that your friends or acquaintances, whatever, the relations you have in your life are pressuring you into drinking or doing anything else you don't want to do, really, those people probably just aren't good friends for you. And that's the unfortunate truth of the matter, is that a lot of people confuse drinking buddies for actual friendships. And so if you have a friendship with somebody that's based on partying, then that is essentially a problematic relationship. And it doesn't mean that you can't turn that into a genuine relationship. But if the whole reason for the relationship existing is that connection between you all going out and partying together, then it's probably superficial. I used to drink a lot, we'll just say. Most of my 20s, I worked in bars. It was really easy to just drink all the time. I didn't have to spend much money on it. But these days, I've cut back to, let's say, having 4 or less drinks a week. And I'll probably continue to cut back just because as I get older, I definitely really appreciate just getting a good night's sleep more than I appreciate getting drunk. And the other thing that's definitely helped me out is that I live in a state where marijuana is legal for recreational consumption. And this has been a really big help because, before I would maybe look to alcohol as a way to release some stress, blow off some tension, or just sort of give myself a reward for dealing with the slings and arrows of how shitty life can be. So now I can, instead of getting drunk, I can maybe get a little bit high. And even though the sensation of, marijuana is certainly different than the sensation you get from alcohol, it still helps me to, say, satisfy that itch to feel something different, and also allows me to process through my feelings, and just way less harmful than alcohol. And there's not even really much debate about that. It's just, it's pretty easy to die from alcohol consumption. It's very hard to die from marijuana consumption. So that's obviously the biggest health risk, but on the lesser extent, there's certainly less other harmful effects with marijuana than alcohol. So I would say if you live somewhere where marijuana is legal, that might be a great harm reduction tool. Now, as a bonus aesthetic goal, I want to talk about gaining fat. Yes, there are definitely people out there who are looking to gain fat for a variety of reasons, either because maybe they're very underweight, they're sort of recovering from like illness or injury, or just because they like the way that it looks on them. And if you spent any time in the internet, then you probably encountered the gainer and feeder subculture of people who get off on getting bigger or helping other people get bigger. And if that's your thing, honestly, fuck it. Like, great for you. Like, I'm actually kind of envious, and I think that the gainer community and the bigger like bear community at large, there's really an emphasis on sort of having this nice, large, round belly, but without adding fat in other areas. So like ideal fat distribution would be like having a big belly, but then still having like visible chest muscles, still having like visible leg muscles, having like a nice defined ass. And the way that you distribute fat on your body is pretty much entirely genetic. I don't think that there's any sort of way of eating or like type of food specifically that's going to get you a belly versus just sort of fat all over. For me, I tend to add fat evenly all over my body rather than getting a distinct belly. So I don't think this is something I could actually achieve, honestly. I'm going to get love handles. I'm going to get fat on my chest way before I ever get a belly, right? And I've heard people say that fat in your love handles is caused from eating excess sugar. But frankly, there's zero fucking evidence for this. It's just one of those things that people repeat because it sounds good, it sounds true, but it's just not. So I don't think there's any sort of way that we can just eat specifically to get a big belly if that's what you're after. Essentially, we just have to do the inverse of what we did for fat loss and create a stable caloric surplus of, let's say, 500 to 1,000 calories a day. And knowing what you take in, knowing what you expend is probably still a good idea if this is something you want to go about doing, because it's going to help you get the results. So I think, if you were looking to add weight quickly, it's probably a good idea to maybe focus more on eating more carbs than, say, eating more fat or protein, but you're probably just going to want to increase all of your macronutrient intake. I don't know. I could be making the carb thing up. I really could be. It feels right. But this is what I said before about like the sugar thing, is that sometimes things just feel right. And so we assume that they are, and maybe there's literally nothing remotely valid about that. I will say that in terms of like health outcomes, it is considered that the fat around your midsection is less healthy than fat that is evenly distributed around the body. So one of the main reasons for that is that when you get a lot of fat on your belly, on your midsection, a lot of the fat is added. Some of the fat is added on top of your abdominal muscles. A lot of it's added underneath your abdominal muscles, and that's like inside your organ cavity. So this is called intra-abdominal fat. And so that fat sort of crowds your organs and impairs your function. So yes, that could potentially have negative health outcomes, but I would also say that if looking that way makes you feel good about yourself, gives you a positive impact on your mental health, improves your quality of life, I think that probably more than cancels that out for you. And so ultimately, you just got to do what feels good sometimes. And we live in a bleak hellscape. Like, let's not mince words. Like, things fucking suck. And so we really need to embrace what joy we can find when we can find it. And if having a big fucking belly makes you feel good, then fuck it. Go for it. Do it. Commit to it. All right, so that was the fitness primer. I've gone through 17 pages of notes. There's been, 7,000 digressions and tangents, but we've finally reached the end. I hope that y'all got some value out of this, even if at times it's been confusing or contradictory. But that's the reality of fitness and nutrition science, is that we are still very much in the infancy. We really have only begun to scratch the surface of what is out there. And so things are going to keep coming out that are going to keep being conflicting and confusing. All the new information that comes out, focus on the basics, right? Focus on what works for you and what feels good, and let the rest of it take care of itself. In the next episode, I will be covering how you can identify and also accept your genetic potential and also your genetic limitations. And that's both in terms of what your body looks like and what it can do. Now, that should be a shorter episode, but, I thought this one was going to be kind of short, and I just kept fucking adding to the script. So we'll see. And also someday I will figure out a cool way to wrap up these episodes, but that day is not today. All right. Bye, bros. That's why we're living it up at the butt sex disco. Getting it on with all of my homos. Loving it up at the butt sex disco. Dancing around like I'm Yoko Ono. Queer